Hey Adventure, so today is going to be another review of The Rings of Power. This is for episode 5 of season 2, and didn't write nearly as many thoughts as I did for episode 3, or for episode 4, I mean, and so hopefully it won't be 35 minutes long to review this. Hopefully it'll be like 10 or 15 or less, maybe. I don't know. Anyways, rather than rambling on and make it that long, let's jump into it. So the first thing I did, or I wrote, the first note I wrote is that I don't like that the dwarven rings are acting the same as the one does. And what I mean by that is that I don't like how the dwarven rings are whispering and just completely changing the person in the same way that the one ring does, because I don't feel like that's what they should be doing. I feel like that's what they were intended to do by Sauron, but that's not what they're intended to do. That's what the effect would have been had Sauron given them to men. Okay, so lore-wise, the rings of power, all of them were created for the elves. The 9 were created first with basically as practice, as a way to practice. Then the 7 were again still practice. And then lastly, the 3 rings were created for the elves without the influence of Sauron, without Sauron's touch at all. He had nothing to do with the creation of the 3 rings. And so they were completely devoid of his influence in that way. I can't clearly say whether or not they were created for humans and for dwarves, because it's not specifically stated whether or not they are. But it seems to be as if the 9 and the 7 were created with the intention of the elves wearing them, but then they created the three, which the elves wore, and Sauron distributed the 7 and the 9, or rather, Sauron decided to distribute the 7 and the 9 when they decided that they weren't as perfect as they wanted them to be. And so, after Sauron was no longer influencing the creation of them, then they created the 7, or the 3, I mean. Because of that, it's heavily implied that the 9 and the 7 were also created with the intent of the elves using them, not the humans, not the dwarves. And so within the lore of this specific show, having them create them specifically for the different races, okay, that's fine, whatever. But lore-wise, it's not stated quite so clearly. My point being with all of this is to say that I don't like that the 7 rings are acting exactly the same as the One Ring does to Frodo, to Sam, to Bilbo, to anybody who is in contact with the One Ring. The 7 are acting almost exactly the same, other than that they don't turn the bearer invisible. Which, whether or not they should, is a different conversation. I don't mind that they don't. I don't have a problem with the fact that they don't turn them invisible. And this is taking a lot longer to get through, so I'm going to just move on and say I don't like that we're hearing whispers from the dwarven rings and that they're corrupting the dwarves in the same way, because that specifically is stated that the dwarves are not corrupted in the same way as the humans were. Okay, so then it was just a very obvious CGI moment, and that was not good. Just like bad enough to completely remove you from immersion. And that was when King Durin III took the pickaxe and slammed it into the wall and sunk it completely into the wall. The hole that was being dug or hewn was just not good. It was so obviously CGI, and that's not something that they should be proud of. The rest of it looked good, except that one thing. It was so clearly not real. Again, we have no timeline. We have no idea how long anything has taken. It sounds as if Narvi and Celebrimbor have been working on the Doors of Durin for ages, for years and years, or for at least several months, for a long time, and that they've been trying to figure out how to do the Doors of Durin, and yet we've heard nothing of it, except that, oh, now we have the Doors of Durin, and this is going to be a new time for friendship between elves and dwarves and stuff like that. And the doors just appear there, which I understand that they have to. I understand that has to be done before the rest of the stuff happens with Celebrimbor and all that stuff. So, like, I get it, but it's also not the greatest. A timeline of some sort would be really beneficial. All right. So yeah, we have how long. Basically, my question is how long have Narvi and Celebrimbor been working together? Because we just don't know. I also made note that the manipulation in this episode is very different. It's done in a very different way. It's done in a the rest of the time it's been Sauron stoking Celebrimbor's ego and being like, yes, look at all these things that you can do, and that I'm sent here to help you do these things. Whereas this one, it's, you didn't do what I told you to. And it's very manipulative, very just like somebody who's disappointed in the person that they're training and that they're working with. And Celebrimbor is just deciding, you know what, I want to do my own thing. But it's also nice to see Celebrimbor finally thinking and thinking about and seeing the way that the manipulation is changing and seeing how manipulative Anatar is being, and to say, there's something going on here beyond we're just forging rings for the protection and well-being of Middle Earth. So that's good to see. I like the scene with Farazan talking to, what's his name? Kemen, I think, talking about the Undying Lands, and sometimes from the very peak of the Minotama you can see Edessea and stuff like that. And I like that because that's an important part of the lore, that Farazan's, his great folly is that, well, there's lots of them, but his greatest is that he chooses to sail to the Undying Lands, to Valinor. And that's what causes the destruction of Numenor, the fall of Numenor, is Farazan and his hubris and his pride. Let's see, I liked seeing how split the loyalties are. Elendil being captain, and he's saying, no, I'm not captain, because he's trying to respect what it was that Miriel said to him. And he said, I'm no longer captain. I gave my sword up. I gave my position up. I don't love the forced conflict between him and his daughter, his made-up daughter, that is not actually his daughter in the books. I don't love that, but the rest of the stuff going on there was really good, and seeing how the people, the sailors, look to their captain, who they trust because he's a captain and they've worked with him and they know who he is and they know how he thinks and they've served under him and they've grown to trust him. And seeing that they still hold loyalty to Elendil, and then understanding what that means for the future, lore-wise, that's all good stuff. And then Disa drops a crystal ball, and it just rolls, and it rolls, and it rolls, and it rolls, and it rolls, and then it stops, just randomly, on this little teeny tiny rock that it just conveniently stops before it falls into the water. It's so bad. Like, it's just so bad. That's not how anything works. I'm sorry, but it wouldn't have worked that way. It wouldn't have done that. So that was just another thing that just, like, they've done so good with this season about being better about those types of things that just don't make sense, and yet they still can't avoid them. They have to be done because they have to get the story to a certain point, and there's no other way to do it than to force something to happen. So anyways, didn't like that. I wrote that it's not lore accurate, because it's not, but the story of the ring forging is interesting for a show. The way that they're telling this story, and the way that the conflict within just this aspect of the story is building, is actually interesting. Like, that's a good part of the show, that there's some things going on with the forging, or the desire to forge the nine, Celebrimbor's refusal, Anatar's, okay, fine, I'll do it by myself then, and the supposed mistakes, the Elven Smith gal accidentally putting on one of the rings and turning invisible and seeing into the spirit, the unseen realm. There's a whole bunch of that stuff that I really appreciated the storytelling of it in this show. Even if it's not accurate, I still appreciated the actual storytelling aspect of it. I really liked the Numenor stuff in this episode. The Faithful versus the Kingsmen, that stuff was really good. The Landale in this episode was really good. I don't care for that last scene with him where he turns away from Kemen and is just like, all right, whatever, I'll listen to the king. I feel like him letting his guard down in that way wasn't something, not something that he would have done, not something that a trained soldier like him would have done, and so I didn't care for that scene. I liked everything going on around it. Just that one specific moment I didn't care for, I didn't think worked, and I know exactly why they did it. They did it so that the next moment could happen and be believable, but it also wasn't. It broke the immersion because that's not how that character would have acted, because of who that character is, being a soldier and a trained sailor, and he would have paid better attention. So didn't care for that specific part of it, but the rest of everything going on around it was really good. All right, then twisting the blame for the rings onto Celebrimbor, but pretending it's the both of them. So Anatar says something. Celebrimbor talks about how it's Anatar's fault because they made the 7 rings, and Anatar says no, it's both of ours. Basically he says no, it's the fault of both of us because, and then he proceeds to tell him, because you wrote the letter to Gil-galad saying that the forge was shut down, we're not doing any more, we're just happy that the 3 worked, and come visit us in Eregion and we'll be happy. He says no, it's both of our faults, but it's actually your fault, Celebrimbor, because you wrote the letter. I told you you shouldn't lie to Gil-galad, and yet you did it anyways. And he's saying it's both of our faults, and then just saying, but it's actually your fault, Celebrimbor. And of course, Sauron Anatar at that time is knowing full well that it's his fault entirely, that he chose, he influenced the rings. The rings are acting exactly like he wanted them to, all of that kind of stuff. And it's just a interesting way for, what's his name, Sauron Anatar, to twist that blame onto Celebrimbor by saying, oh no, it's both of our faults. All right, just one more note on the things in the episode, and then the kind of the final thoughts. The acting for Celebrimbor in this episode was phenomenal. This is I mean, throughout the whole season the actor's done a really good job, and last season as well, but this episode especially, you got to, he was still clearly that same Celebrimbor that we were seeing, but he's very different, and the actor's portrayal of this descent into madness is very well done. I'm very impressed with the acting in this episode. So this is kind of my overall thoughts of the episode, and then I'll do my rating. And that's, so last week I talked about how the episode made me feel like Tolkien. To me it felt Tolkienian. Obviously there was things that didn't, but just as a whole it felt more Tolkienian than most of the other things, and it made me want to go appreciate nature, this kind of stuff. This episode, I didn't get a super strong Tolkienian feeling from. At least not nearly the same way as I did with the last episode. But as a story, is very, very strong story-wise. And so there's a little bit of a trade-off there between, well, is it good because it's a good story, or is it bad because it's not Tolkienian? And this is the hard thing with adaptation, especially with something that doesn't actually have much in the way of source material. There's a lot, but especially from what they have access to, there's not a ton of source material that they can draw on for the events. And so we look at that and say, oh, well, this doesn't feel Tolkienian because these events don't happen in this way, and that's not right. And sure, but it's also the themes and the way that the story is being told that didn't feel nearly as Tolkienian in this episode. However, the other thing, and I've said this time and time again, yes, obviously I want it to be accurate to the lore, but I will settle for a good story. If the story is good, I can forgive a bad adaptation. And the example that I always use, that I always go to, is How to Train Your Dragon. Those movies are fantastic movies. Just some of the best animated movies ever. And yet, really, they are horrible adaptations of the books because they're not adaptations of the books. But they are very, very good movies. And so if a story is good, I can forgive it not being a faithful adaptation. If the story is bad, like season 1 was, and the adaptation is unfaithful, that's not good. There's nothing good about that. This season has been far better of a season story-wise. And this episode was a very good episode story-wise, but it wasn't great in terms of being Tolkienian or being an adaptation of Tolkien's work. So anyways, what is my episode of a fantasy TV show rating? I would put it at like an 8.5 out of 10. I thought it was a really good episode of fantasy TV show. As an episode of Lord of the Rings, it's more like a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10. It's not horrible, and it's significantly better than a lot of what's been going on. But there's also some things that are just there's so much about it that's not directly taken from Tolkien's lore, and largely it loses so many points because it doesn't feel Tolkienian in the way that the last episode did, which is why the last episode, even though it broke the lore in a lot of ways, was better, had a higher Tolkienian or episode of Lord of the Rings related thing score. That was, I think I put a 7 or a 7.5 for that episode, and it was just a better something Lord of the Rings related because of the themes and the way that it felt like Tolkien. Whereas this episode didn't. So it's a lower rating on that end, even if there are some things that are in the lore to some degree or are faithful to what they've set up with this show, stuff like that. But as an episode of fantasy TV show, it was a good episode. I enjoyed it. Yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit. As something Lord of the Rings related, my enjoyment was significantly lessened. But anyways, so that is my thoughts on Season 2, Episode 5 of The Rings of Power. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.